A sharp tremor rocked the metallic hulls of the Trion warship, sending sparks cascading from ruptured conduits overhead. The distant wail of alarms blended with the rhythmic pounding of boots as Alpha and his team sprinted through the dimly lit corridor. The attack had been a trap. They had walked directly into the jaws of the enemy. "Move! Keep moving!" Alpha ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. He could feel the disorienting effects of the Trion's energy disruptor already dulling his connection to the energy field that the wax relied on. Their abilities, once an extension of their very being, were now faltering, flickering like dying embers. If they were to survive, they had to rely on strategy, not power. Lyra, just a few paces ahead, glanced over her shoulder. Her luminous eyes, usually serene and calculating, now flickered with urgency. "They're blocking every route back to the hangar. We're being herded deeper inside." Alpha clenched his jaw. The Trions were playing a cruel game. This was no ordinary ambush, it was an orchestrated hunt. A plan designed to break them. He pressed his hand against the smooth metal walls, searching for even the faintest trace of energy left to manipulate, but there was nothing. The disruptor was stronger than anything they had encountered before. Behind them, the thunder of advancing enemy forces grew louder. The Trions weren't in a rush, they knew their prey was weakening. A sudden flash of red light burst from a side corridor, barely missing one of the wax operatives. He stumbled, his balance failing, but Alpha caught him and yanked him forward. "Stay together." Ahead, the corridor split into two paths. One led towards the heart of the ship, deeper into unknown dangers. The other curved sharply, but the emergency blast doors had already sealed it off. "We don't have a choice," Lyra said, her voice laced with frustration. "We keep moving forward." Alpha nodded, making the decision in an instant. The team pressed on, the hum of Trion weapons close behind. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, as if the ship itself were exhaling its icy breath upon them. The walls gleamed with an eerie bioluminescent glow, casting their surroundings in a sickly green hue. A sudden impact sent another shudder through the ship. Something massive had struck from the outside. Whether it was the wax fleet or another Trion maneuver, Alpha couldn't tell. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the immediate threat. As they rounded a bend, a new sound cut through the chaos, a sharp mechanical hiss. Alpha skidded to a halt, raising a hand to signal the others. A few feet ahead, the walls themselves seemed to shift, panels retracting to reveal rows of sentry turrets emerging from their hidden compartments. A defense mechanism designed to cut down intruders. "They were expecting us," Lyra breathed. A cold realization settled over Alpha. "No," he murmured. "They wanted us here." Before he could give another order, the sentry turrets activated. Bright energy beams sliced through the corridor, forcing the team to scatter. Without their energy manipulation, they were vulnerable. They needed a way past the defenses, and fast. Lyra's gaze darted around before landing on a control panel embedded in the wall. "I can disable them, but I'll need time." Time was something they didn't have. The Trions were closing in from behind. The sentry turrets were relentless, cutting off any chance of retreat. Alpha made a split-second decision. "Go. I'll cover you." Lyra hesitated, eyes locking onto his. "Alpha. Do it," he barked, drawing the enemy fire as he ducked behind a support column. The rest of the team took defensive positions, using what little cover they had to return fire. Their weapons were no match for the Trion's heavy armor, but they had no other choice. Lyra sprinted to the control panel, fingers flying across the unfamiliar interface. Her heart pounded as she bypassed layers of security. Seconds felt like eternity as the battle raged behind her. Almost there. A sudden surge of static electricity ran through the air, and the sentry turrets powered down. The corridor fell into eerie silence. "Now. Move." Alpha ordered, helping his team push forward before the Trions could react. They dashed through the deactivated kill zone, but just as they reached the end of the hall, a heavy impact sent them sprawling to the floor. A reinforced blast door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a massive chamber. The trap was complete. From the shadows ahead, a deep, guttural voice rumbled. "You cannot escape, Alpha of the Wax. This time, you will not leave alive." The towering figure of a Trion warlord stepped into the dim light, his crimson visor burning like an omen of death. Behind him, more soldiers emerged, blocking every exit. Alpha slowly rose to his feet, his breath steady despite the odds. They were surrounded, cut off, and their powers were still weakened. But if the Trions thought they would surrender without a fight, they were gravely mistaken. This was only the beginning. The corridors of the Trion warship were a labyrinth of dimly lit passages, lined with pulsating conduits that carried power through the vessel like arteries in a living organism. Every step the team took echoed in the silence, a reminder that they were deep in enemy territory, and their time was running out. Alpha led the way, his keen senses scanning for any possible exit. Their original path back to the shuttle was cut off, reinforced blast doors had sealed their only known escape route. Without a way out, they would be trapped, helpless against the Trions' overwhelming forces. Lyra skidded to a stop near a control panel embedded in the wall, her glowing eyes flickering as she examined the unfamiliar Trion script. "This isn't just a security terminal. It's linked to the power grid," she murmured. "If I can access it, I might be able to take down their disruptor field long enough for us to use our energy abilities." Alpha placed a hand on her shoulder. "How long do you need?" "Minutes, if I don't trigger a failsafe." "Seconds, if I do." Before Alpha could respond, a metallic growl echoed through the corridor. The team turned as a series of red lights flickered to life down the passageway. Then came the sound, heavy boots pounding against the floor, growing closer with each second. "They're tracking us," Kale hissed, raising his weapon. "We don't have minutes." Alpha snapped. "Lyra, do it now. Everyone else, hold the line." Lyra's fingers flew across the control panel, her mind racing to break the encryption. The Trion's security was sophisticated, layers upon layers of failsafes designed to detect and shut down intrusions. But she had no choice. She had to work faster. The first Trion soldier appeared at the far end of the corridor, his crimson visor locking onto them like a predator spotting its prey. More followed, their massive frames moving with terrifying efficiency. Within seconds, energy rifles were raised, targeting systems engaged. The air erupted with the hiss of plasma fire. Alpha lunged forward, his reflexes barely keeping ahead of the incoming barrage. Kale and the others fired back, their shots striking Trion armor but barely making a dent. The enemy soldiers pressed forward, forcing the team into a desperate retreat. "Lyra!" Alpha shouted, deflecting a shot with his blade. "We need that disruptor down." Almost there, she gritted out, sweat beading on her brow as she worked frantically. "Just a few more." A Trion soldier broke through the defensive line, lunging at her with a blade crackling with energy. At the last second, Alpha intercepted, locking weapons in a deadly struggle. The force of the blow sent vibrations up his arms, but he held firm. "Now, Lyra," he roared. With a final keystroke, Lyra overrode the system. The power grid flickered, then failed. A pulse of energy rippled through the ship, and suddenly, Alpha felt it. The dampening field suppressing their abilities was gone. His power surged back. A brilliant light erupted around him as his energy manipulation reignited. With a single motion, he sent a wave of force crashing into the Trions, sending them staggering backward. Lyra, now free to use her abilities, reinforced the walls with barriers of crackling light, holding back the advancing troops. "Move!" Alpha ordered. "We don't have long before they reset the system." The team sprinted down the corridor, now able to carve their way through the ship. But even with their powers restored, the Trions would not stop. The chase was far from over. The metallic corridor trembled with distant tremors as Alpha and his team sprinted through the Trion warship, their path illuminated by flickering emergency lights. The alarm klaxons wailed, an unrelenting echo of the chaos they had unleashed. Behind them, Trion patrols moved fast, their boots pounding against the steel floor. "Keep moving," Alpha commanded, his voice firm but strained. They had managed to disrupt part of the warship's power grid, buying themselves a small window of opportunity, but the Trions were already adjusting. If they didn't find an escape soon, the entire ship would close in around them. As they turned down another corridor, the passage split into two directions. The bulkheads groaned as another explosion shook the structure. A massive section of the ceiling collapsed between them, sending metal debris crashing down in a blinding surge of sparks and smoke. Alpha reacted instantly, reaching for Lyra, but she was already on the other side of the wreckage. "Alpha," she shouted, her voice barely cutting through the noise. He pushed against the debris, but it was too thick, the wreckage jammed against the corridor's reinforced walls. The others, Rylan, Kira, and the remaining warriors, were on the opposite side, staring through the gap. "We can't get through," Kira called. "We'll find another route and meet up." "No," Alpha said, his fists clenching. "We don't separate." "There's no choice," Lyra said, pressing a hand to the damaged surface. Her glowing eyes met his. "We'll find another way, but you need to keep going." Alpha exhaled sharply. He didn't like this. Not at all. But they were running out of time. Rylan gave a firm nod. "We'll regroup at the lower hangar." "Just get there." Alpha hesitated, then stepped back. "Be careful." With one last glance, the others turned and disappeared down the corridor. Lyra exhaled, shaking off the tension in her limbs. She and Alpha were alone now. The alarms continued to blare, and footsteps echoed in the distance. Trion patrols were closing in. "This way," she whispered, grabbing Alpha's wrist and pulling him into a side passage. They moved fast, weaving through the narrow, dimly lit maintenance tunnels. The air was thick with the scent of burning wires, and the walls vibrated with the ship's shifting energy patterns. Finally, Lyra found a broken section of the ship, a collapsed storage bay, half destroyed from the internal explosions they had triggered earlier. Alpha crouched beside her as they ducked behind a broken support beam, listening. Heavy boots marched past just outside their hiding spot. The Trions were scanning the area, their guttural voices exchanging orders. Lyra's breath was slow, controlled, but Alpha could feel the tension in her frame. They were dangerously close to being discovered. After several agonizing moments, the patrol moved on. Lyra exhaled and leaned her back against the cold metal wall. "We need to keep moving," Alpha whispered, but Lyra didn't respond right away. She was staring at him, her glowing gaze filled with something unreadable. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "I won't let you die here." Alpha froze. Her words were a promise, spoken with absolute certainty. He had always admired Lyra's strength, her unwavering determination. But something in her tone now was different, raw, unguarded. "I won't let you die here either," he said after a moment. "That's not the same." Alpha frowned slightly. "Lyra." "I mean it," she cut him off, voice softer now. "I don't care what happens, I'll get you out of here, even if it costs me everything." A cold knot formed in Alpha's chest. He had seen Lyra risk herself time and time again for the wax, for their survival. But this was different. This wasn't about the mission. It was about him. "Don't say that," he said. She turned to him fully now, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Because I can't lose you." The thought came instantly, but he hesitated, the words heavy in his throat. He had spent years carrying the weight of his people's survival, making decisions that shaped the future of an entire civilization. He had trained himself to think strategically, to suppress emotions that could cloud his judgment. But this was different. This was Lyra. For the first time, he was afraid. Not of the war, not of death, but of losing her. His fingers curled slightly. The ship trembled again, but neither of them moved. They just stood there, staring at each other in the dim light, surrounded by ruins, with war closing in around them. Then, from deeper within the damaged chamber, something stirred. A faint hum. A pulse of power. Alpha immediately turned his attention toward it. What was that? Lyra whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, drawn toward the sound. Something was here. And whatever it wasn't part of the Trion warship. The dimly lit chamber pulsed with a low hum, an unnatural energy vibrating through the air. Alpha's glowing gaze swept over the collapsed wreckage, his senses alert. This section of the warship had been damaged during their sabotage efforts, but something beneath the destruction still functioned. Lyra crouched beside him, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. That sound, it's coming from below. Alpha nodded. There's something hidden here. He placed his palm against the surface, focusing. Even without full access to his energy abilities, he could still sense distortions in the surrounding energy fields. Beneath the debris, something pulsed, not a reactor, not standard Trion technology. Lyra's hands moved swiftly, her sharp mind already piecing together a solution. If we can access the ship's auxiliary systems, I can tap into their data logs. Maybe figure out what we're dealing with. She pointed to a damaged but active console across the chamber, its interface flickering erratically. We don't have much time, Alpha said. The Trions will realize we're missing soon. Lyra didn't need any more encouragement. She sprinted toward the console, sliding behind it as her hands danced over the unfamiliar controls. The screen flickered with alien symbols, cascading through encrypted files. Her jaw tightened. They've locked it down, she muttered, fingers flying across the interface. But I can break through. Alpha stood watch, listening for movement in the corridors beyond. Every second they lingered was dangerous. But then. I'm in. The console's interface flashed red, and lines of data scrolled rapidly. Lyra's expression shifted, first confusion, then horror. Alpha saw it immediately. What? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Oh no. Alpha, this isn't just about conquering wax. She turned to face him, her glowing eyes wide with realization. They don't want to rule it. They want to erase it. Alpha stepped closer, scanning the screen. Lines of Trion command logs appeared, detailing Wax's energy structure, planetary defenses, and something far worse. The energy disruptor they had encountered was just a prototype, a small-scale test of something far more devastating. A countdown had already begun. This is a planetary-class weapon, Lyra breathed. They're building a pulse bomb, one powerful enough to destabilize the entire planet's energy field. Alpha's chest tightened. How long? Lyra's fingers trembled as she accessed the activation sequence. She scrolled down, then froze. It's already started. Alpha's pulse pounded in his ears. How long, Lyra? He repeated. She turned to him, her voice hollow. 4 hours. Silence fell between them. In 4 hours, Wax would cease to exist. This wasn't just an invasion. It was extinction. Alpha inhaled sharply, his mind racing. We have to stop this. Lyra nodded, already pulling the core data onto a small energy drive. I need more time. If I can trace the exact location of the bomb's activation site, we might have a chance to shut it down. Alpha tightened his fists. They couldn't afford to fail. Everything, their people, their home, their entire existence, depended on what they did next. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. The Trions were coming. Work fast, Alpha said, stepping in front of her. I'll hold them off. Lyra barely spared him a glance. Just don't die before I finish. The urgency in her voice was different this time, not just determination, but fear. Alpha didn't answer. He turned toward the door, his stance firm. For the first time in his existence, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting against time itself. The warship shuddered violently as explosions rippled through its corridors. The disruptor system was moments away from collapse, its core failing under the overload of energy charges. Sirens blared in overlapping frequencies, drowning out everything but the pounding of footsteps as Alpha, Lyra, and their team raced through the metal passageways, searching for an escape. But then, a sudden, searing blast cut through the air. A beam of red-hot energy pierced through one of their own. Time seemed to slow as the strike hit its mark. A cry of pain echoed through the corridor. Lyra turned sharply, eyes widening in horror. No. It was Elias, the sharp-minded strategist who had fought alongside them since the beginning. He stumbled, clutching his side where the energy had torn through his armor, leaving a glowing, scorched wound. His breath hitched, his legs buckling beneath him. Behind him, a Trion commander loomed, stepping forward with his energy blade still humming from the strike. His visor gleamed red, his stance unshaken. Alpha reacted instantly, surging forward and driving his blade through the Trion's chest. The enemy soldier choked, then collapsed, lifeless. But there was no time to celebrate. Elias was falling. Lyra was at his side in an instant, her hands pressing against the wound, energy flickering around her palms. But it wasn't working. The injury was too severe. Elias coughed, his voice strained. Looks like I won't make it out of this one. Alpha knelt beside him, his jaw tightening. Don't talk like that. We're getting out of here. A weak smirk crossed Elias's lips. You always were, a terrible liar. His gaze flickered to Lyra. You take care of him, all right? Lyra's breath trembled. Elias. Another violent tremor rocked the ship. Sparks erupted from the walls as the disruptor core finally collapsed, sending a surge of energy rippling through the entire structure. A shockwave rushed through them, and suddenly, they felt it. Their energy abilities had returned. Lyra gasped as the familiar hum of power flowed through her veins again, her body instinctively reacting to it. Alpha clenched his fists, feeling the energy pulse beneath his skin, stronger than ever. But it didn't matter. Because Elias was slipping away. His eyes flickered, then closed for the final time. Silence. Lyra shook her head. No. No, we can still. Alpha gently touched her arm. He's gone. She stared down at Elias, hands trembling, before clenching them into fists. A storm of emotions raged in her chest, grief, anger, and the horrible, crushing weight of loss. But there was no time to mourn. The walls groaned, metal twisting as the explosion spread through the warship. The alarms screamed louder, an automated voice echoing over the intercom. Critical failure detected. Structural collapse imminent. Alpha stood, his face unreadable. We have to go. Lyra hesitated for only a second before closing Elias's eyes with a gentle hand. Then she rose to her feet, her expression now hardened. They had won a battle. But it had come at a terrible cost. And worse, they were still trapped inside the enemy warship, with no way out. The corridors of the collapsing warship flashed with warning lights, the metal groaning as explosions ripped through its structure. They were running out of time. Alpha led the way, his focus locked on the path ahead, but Lyra's mind was still reeling. They had lost Elias. The cost of war had never felt so personal, so raw. She could still feel his weight in her arms, still hear his final words. But what terrified her the most wasn't just the loss. It was the fact that she could have lost Alpha too. And she couldn't stay silent anymore. They reached a dimly lit junction where Alpha paused, scanning their surroundings. The path to the docking bay was still clear, for now. Their team had taken a separate route, heading for the stolen ships, leaving them a few precious moments alone. Lyra stopped, her breath unsteady. "Alpha, wait." Alpha turned, eyes sharp with urgency. "We have to keep moving." She shook her head. "Not yet." His expression flickered with something unreadable, impatience. Concern. But when she stepped closer, something in his gaze softened. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the chaos, it felt like a thunderclap. "I can't keep pretending, Alpha. Not after today. Not after losing Elias. Not after almost losing you." Alpha's entire body tensed. "Lyra. No. Let me say it." She held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I care about you. More than I should. More than I ever planned to." For the first time, Alpha didn't know what to say. She let out a breath, searching his face for any sign of rejection, but instead, she saw hesitation, conflict. Alpha looked away, exhaling sharply. "Lyra, you know what I am. What I was created for." She stepped even closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You are not just a weapon. You are not just a leader. You are more than what they made you." His fingers curled into fists. "If I let myself feel this, if I let myself love you," he stopped himself, his jaw tightening. "I can't afford to be weak." Her heart ached at those words. "Love isn't weakness, Alpha." Her voice wavered, but her conviction did not. "You taught me that. You gave me something to believe in when everything else felt lost." He finally met her eyes again, and for the briefest moment, the unyielding leader, the warrior, was gone. It was just Alpha. Just a man standing at the edge of something terrifying. The ship shook violently, a deep, guttural groan of metal tearing apart. The alarms screamed louder, and reality came crashing back. Alpha reached for her hand, not out of strategy, not out of necessity, but because he needed to feel her warmth. "If we survive this," he said, his voice quiet, "we'll talk about this. I promise." Lyra's chest tightened, but she nodded. It wasn't everything. But it was something. Their hands parted just as a distant explosion sent a shockwave through the corridor. The moment was over. They were back to war. "Let's move," Alpha commanded. And this time, Lyra followed, knowing that no matter what happened next, nothing between them would ever be the same. The Trion warship trembled under the force of cascading explosions. Emergency sirens blared through the corridors as Alpha and Lyra fought their way toward the hangar. The wax strike team, battered but determined, struggled against the overwhelming enemy forces. Plasma fire lit up the darkened passageways, and the acrid scent of burning metal filled the air. Alpha moved like a storm, his energy blade carving through the enemy ranks. With a surge of force, he sent a shockwave down the corridor, momentarily breaking the Trion formation. "Move! Get to the ship," he commanded. A blast from above sent debris crashing down, and Lyra stumbled. The impact disrupted her focus, her energy flickering. Before she could fall into the widening breach in the hull, Alpha caught her wrist. Their eyes met, briefly, a silent vow. They would not let go. With renewed determination, they reached their escape vessel, the hull already scorched from enemy fire. The moment they boarded, the doors sealed shut. Alpha took the controls, hands moving swiftly over the interface. "Strap in," he muttered as the ship lurched forward. Behind them, the warship erupted in a chain reaction of explosions, its structural integrity failing. The wax vessel shot out just in time, dodging flaming wreckage. But the battle was far from over. As the smoke cleared, the scale of the enemy force became horrifyingly clear. The Trion armada was waiting. Massive dreadnoughts loomed like silent leviathans, their weapons charging. Swarms of fighters moved in coordinated formations, sealing every possible escape route. This wasn't just a fleet, it was an extermination force. Lyra's voice was tight. They knew we'd come. Alpha's gaze locked onto the largest vessel, a planetary destabilization platform. Its core pulsed with ominous energy. This was it. The weapon designed to destroy Wax. Meanwhile, on Wax, the worst was unfolding. The planet's energy shields flickered and cracked under the relentless assault. The once harmonious energy flows were unraveling. The Trions had already begun the final phase of their attack. Alpha clenched his jaw. We have to warn them. We have to stop that weapon. Lyra met his gaze, the weight of their responsibility pressing down on them. Then we go through. Alpha nodded. No more running. No more hesitation. With the entire Trion fleet between them and Wax, there was only one way forward, straight through the heart of the enemy.